Hello, everyone. Today I'll be speaking about Returnal. This is going to be a little different from previous commentaries, largely because I'll be doing a lot of this off the cuff in an ad hoc sort of way without a script. I did write a script of around 19,000 words, but when I was thinking about how Returnal plays as a video game, it just didn't seem right. One of the big reasons why I like doing commentaries is because I want it to be as contingent or as contextual to the game as possible. And doing that with Returnal and it being a roguelike, offering a lot of different options, it just didn't seem like the way to do a commentary for Returnal. So I thought I would try a different form factor by doing something that's more just riffing on how I feel about the game. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started properly. I'll be playing this on the PC with mouse and keyboard, as you can see here. Probably a lot of the movements you can already tell are on mouse and keyboard. Playing it on the PC, which came out February 15th, 2023. There were some updates that came out after this to improve performance, and this recording comes in right in the middle of those, so you'll likely see some interesting aspects of the gameplay, especially in Echoing Ruins, the fourth biome. I'll talk about that when we get there. But for the most part, it should be okay. I'm playing with ray tracing off, except for ray tracing audio, which I turned on. I happen to be a big fan of audio, and so I was grateful that that even existed at all. I think that's a monument to audio, just to even have that. I will admit that my ears aren't really trained enough to notice a profound difference between ray traced audio and not ray traced audio, so I'll be curious to see what other people think about the concept of ray traced audio in the future. Maybe it didn't make a big difference functionally. I think as I was playing Returnal, the audio was so precise that I was able to pinpoint where enemies were at all times. So that's something I'll probably be bringing up as we go along as well. Like I said before, this came out on the PlayStation 5 originally, sometime in 2021. I think there's a good case to be made that Returnal could have been the killer app for the PlayStation 5. What I mean to say with the killer app is that there are occasions where a company will want to justify the cost of a video game console with what's known as a killer app, which means you have to own that particular item in order to experience the thing that everyone is talking about. So to give you an example, for a long time the Microsoft Xbox, the original one released in 2001, was what people called a Halo machine, just because Halo was the thing to play on the original Xbox, and there wasn't much else out on release. So Halo effectively made the Xbox a reason to expend that kind of expensive money for such a new console by a new company. Well, not new. Microsoft has been around for a long time, but newly exploring the medium of video games. Here you can see that I'm jumping over some of the tile sets in Returnal to get to these power-ups. So Returnal uses certain rooms that repeat and in randomized tile sets, but once you start to understand what these tile sets are, they occur in a stable way, meaning that you can kind of anticipate what to see. So I was able to leap over those with those columns in the air. And then there are some underwater spots which you can't really get to until you've unlocked these Metroid-inspired navigation tools. So one of them being the ability to go underwater. Going back to what I was saying about Returnal being the killer app, I think Returnal could have been the killer app if it had released closer to release day. I think during the COVID-19 pandemic, that I suppose was out of the question. The PlayStation 5 released in November of 2020, and it had a very small set of original content. for the game at that time. Returnal did come out later, and in my mind, Returnal is a truly PlayStation 5 next generation experience. I think the legacy of the PlayStation 4, for example, is largely going to be based on the open world formula, and to some extent that's still true. We do have open world games, but the trend is leaning less towards open world and more towards a curated, close-knit experience that has the illusion of an open world, less so than previous games, but with a more forceful, impactful set of circumstances in the immediate moment. And so, for starters, Returnal is open in the sense that you can go to these places and there are no loading screens, which I think is deeply impressive. But I think the idea of Returnal being more of a randomized roguelike game told in the AAA space comes from recent influences like Hades and Noida and Dead Cells and plenty of other roguelike games that have attempted to take the arcade formula of the past and give it a blending twist to make it more replayable. Returnal has these features. Like I said before, it has the tile sets, but it also has a large swath of randomized items and weapons, and in the layouts of these situations, there are different enemy placements to kind of keep the player on their toes. Here you'll notice I'm using the Pyroshell Caster. It's a grenade launcher type weapon. This is actually a rarity in the game. One of the big critiques that I'm going to make about Returnal is that it tries to take that next generation set of ideas, the arcade and the roguelike, and I think it performs it rather poorly. The reasoning behind that I hope to prove to you as we go along. Here you notice that I'm immediately picking up the Rot Gland Lobber after the Pyroshell Caster. So one of the problems that I'm trying to articulate here in Returnal between its arcade and its roguelike is that it tries to create synergies like a roguelike in the way that you'd expect, with certain items appealing over others, and yet it tries to maintain a sense of control with its arcade systems, and I think it suffers for trying to combine the two in the way that Returnal did. That's not to say that it can't be done, it's just that it's very difficult to do so with Housemarque's philosophy of being steeped in arcade games. Here you see I switch to the Hollow Seeker. So these are the two main weapons that I will be complaining about in this commentary of Returnal. There's the Hollow Seeker, which is this light machine gun, which comes with some pretty amazing traits, and the Rot Gland Lobber, which is a kind of closer hit scan type weapon, although I think it really travels in a trail, more of a projectile weapon, but it leaves behind a trail of acid, hence the rot in the Rot Gland Lobber title. Here you see me destroying these flying types. I think one of the benefits of Returnal is that it has a great deal of enemy variety in each area. There are some cases where there is a blending of enemies that you've seen before with perhaps a twist to make them a little bit more difficult. But for the most part, I think that the game does a pretty amazing job with the design of enemies. I think they look really cool. Here I'm in a particular tile set area where you can enter into optional hidden areas. I did that with an item, but you can also find them throughout the world. And these are point of no return areas. Once you've entered into these areas, you can't go back. Some of these areas are unquestionably good, where they offer an item or an artifact that doesn't cost anything, and you simply have to retrieve it. There are some that are in the middle, where there are items, but there is some kind of barrier or force blocking you. And then there's the likely bad scenario where sometimes you can be ambushed by a high-level enemy or mini-boss, so it's not always a good thing to enter an optional area, but I would say that it usually justifies the risk. Here in this playthrough, you're going to see me mince with a lot of the items. The recording that I did for this playthrough is actually after the game entirely. So you won't see any cutscenes, you won't see any of the story, and I suppose I should probably talk about that story as we go along, so if you haven't played the game and you have no intention of playing the game, you understand a little bit of the narrative context. So in the game, you play the role of Celine. Celine is a kind of scout explorer of the universe, or of the stars. We don't necessarily know at the beginning what time period this takes place in. We just assume that it's the future. But Celine is crash landing on this planet known as Atropos. There's quite a lot of Greek in the game, which I think is used sometimes well and sometimes poorly, just because it invites a lot of ambiguities that I think were unintentional from the developers. So you are Celine, and you arrive on the ship Helios, and you land on the Atropos. I think the game from there is sort of up to the player as to what they choose to believe. Just know that I'm going to be spoiling things from here on out, so if you wanted to play Returnal for its narrative, then I think you should probably leave and perhaps come back after that. So consider this your spoiler warning. I do enjoy Returnal. I think it's a good game. I'm not sure if it's a great game. I think its narrative is a nice bolster to that, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it is. It provides a large reason. It's certainly the gameplay, which is part of Housemarque's wheelhouse, that is more their style. And a narrative has been added onto it, and I think it was done admirably, but I don't think it necessarily was done perfectly. So Celine lands on this planet, and one of the strangest things that you'll encounter is, as you're maneuvering through, you'll encounter a 20th century house. This house is obviously some kind of, I don't want to say anachronism, but it's it's a thing you would not expect on this alien, strange planet, which has some influences from the likes of Prometheus, the science fiction movie in the Alien franchise, done by Ridley Scott, I believe. Here you're seeing me decide between different consumables here. Sometimes I have the feeling that consumables will disappear. I actually have no real reason to prove that, but I've had 3 consumables and I've been debating between the 2. But sometimes I choose one and then it seems as though the other item disappears. Here you're seeing me test out a Spitmaul blaster, likely just for you, the viewer, so you can see. The Spitmaul, the shotgun, is a pretty good weapon for this area, for overgrown ruins, but it's not necessarily the best weapon for the entirety of the game, and I'll explain that most likely when we get to the boss fights. This is also the one and only time where I found a hidden wall. I did not even realize that hidden walls existed until I watched a YouTube video as one of the tips for playing Returnal. So consider that a tip for yourself. When I picked up that shield cube or that data cube, that helps you to explain that I had never been in there before, because data cubes are non-repeating items. So anyway, so Returnal is about Celine, and as you play these runs, whenever you die, she comes back, and she is able to see the dead bodies of her previous runs. So obviously it puts Celine sort of in a confusing, traumatic backstep where she's wondering why she keeps returning to run after run. A lot of the story attempts to teleologically explain, I suppose, with narrative, why she is doing this in the gameplay. So, like Dark Souls, I suppose, it's a game where the gameplay comes first and the story is a narrative attempt to explain why the gameplay exists in the way that it does, which in my mind is a much better solution to a narrative first game with some gameplay elements, as I think that that's truly where a game stands above in the medium that it's in for how to tell a story. You will come to find out that Celine has a pretty sordid past, and part of it has to do with the existence of a child that she may or may not have been neglecting, as well as a mother who seems to have been quite a curse from her perspective on her life. I'm actually going to stop here for a second and talk about those enemies there. The AI is usually quite good in the sense that they are aggressive, but the more I played the game, the more I realized that quite a few of the enemies are, when given certain circumstances, very bad in the sense that they make a direct pathfinding towards the player, and they end up getting stuck along the walls. So that's what you saw there. Anyway, back to Celine. She has this child named Helios, and there is some leitmotif of an astronaut that haunts Celine as she's going through this world. And as she's encountering these bosses and as she's playing through these areas, she's slowly coming to terms with the idea that she may have done something terribly wrong in her life previously to this crash that she's in denial of. Here I pick up a pylon driver, which is probably the best weapon underneath the two weapons that I've talked about previously, the Hollow Seeker and the Rock Clan Lava, and you're going to see that in spades here, just because the Electron Pylon driver is the sort of easy weapon of the game, in my opinion, in the sense that out of all the weapons, this is probably the one that you have to be the least accurate for, because even if you miss, especially in overgrown ruins, you'll still hit some kind of geometry in the level, which creates these webs of pylon energy, which can cause damage over time to enemies. And that means that you're in a position to set and forget, which means you can fire these pylons semi-accurately or just around the geometry, and then run around and let the damage over time do its work. I like the pylon driver. I like the way it sounds, and I like the energy that it creates visually. I think it's all quite presented well. That's a benefit that I'm probably going to say about Returnal in general, is that it's a game with immaculate presentation. It looks great, it sounds great, and it feels great. But I also think that it, as a weapon, has a place of its own, which is a nice benefit. Each weapon feels very distinct in their behavior. But I preferred other weapons with a little bit more directionality, a little bit more explicitly direct control, especially with a mouse and keyboard. Though I can imagine that with a controller, this would have been a great weapon to use. Alright, so Celine basically is... we're not even sure if she's necessarily an astronaut. This could have all been an imaginary aspect. And one of the decisions you're going to have to make as you play the game is making that sort of decision, wondering whether the Celine that you're seeing is truly existing in this planet of Atropos, or whether this is all going on in her consciousness. Celine made a terrible mistake while driving in a car and drove off of the road when seeing an astronaut, which, as we discover deeply later in the game, is Celine herself. Often the game will invite these sort of ambiguities. So that's the first sort of big contradiction or big paradox is that she is the thing that is causing her to drive off the road, even though she's in the car driving off the road. The second contradiction is that Celine was also the one who destroyed the Atropos flight coming in with a cannon. So how could she be on Atropos and not on Atropos at the same time, causing her own downfall? So both of these things literally might be difficult for the player to explain. Okay, this is a thing that I think is very interesting about the game. I'm going to stop here. Is that you notice that there have been 2 artifacts for breaking yellow barriers. This is an artifact that increases the power of your melee attack to where you can get into certain areas. But one of the things I found fascinating was that here in the shop it was only worth 250 obolites, which is the resource of the game. But in another location, it was worth 350 obolites. Now, why they should be worth 2 different amounts is up to anyone's speculation. I'm not quite sure why it exists in the way that it does. Here you notice that there is a green tower, which offers utility by healing the enemies. This was talked about, I remember, in the previews leading up to the game as like a nice twist to the formula. This doesn't really occur often in the game, in the sense that there aren't a lot of support type scenarios for enemies. So I'm really, I guess, disappointed that it happens quite a bit in Overgrown Ruins, but it doesn't occur in many other places, and there aren't a lot of varieties of ways that it can occur. So going back to Celine's story, you either believe that she is experiencing this all psychologically, and in a psychoanalytic sense, she is in denial and is performing what is called repetition automatism, which is a psychoanalytic Freudian term of doing something over and over again traumatically so as to forget what the original symptom is, which I think is Returnal to a T, rather than face up to the fact that she killed her child and herself in a car accident, and in all likelihood her body is decomposing right now. She prefers purgatory. She prefers to be caught in this scenario of fighting these strange enemies and creatively imagining this world and the xenomorphs in it so as to ignore the truth. So that's one perspective, is that this is all going on in her mind. And I think this is the far more likely outcome, which is why you see the 20th century house the way that you do. I think it helps to explain a lot of the contradictory aspects that we've been speaking about before. I think if you were to take the theory that this occurs in reality, quote unquote, then a lot of the aspects of the story start to invite doubt. And it is here that I can imagine a lot of people having very real problems with the story of Returnal. I'm fortunate enough that I've been educated in the humanities and have a master's degree in English literature, and I'm not trying to flex here, it's just that I've been taught enough about the use of metaphor in form rather than content. So when you get aspects like this, I'm able to sort of categorize a lot of these moments into an understanding of the kind of fiction that they wanted to create, that Housemarque wanted to create with their game Returnal. A lot of other people don't necessarily have that. They tend to believe, quote unquote, or they tend to have buy-in in whatever is going on in front of them. So I think this was a very difficult problem for Returnal. What fictions usually do is they appeal to both the non-knowable reader and to the reader with prior knowledge by creating a scenario where both readings are equally likely and possible. And I think Returnal should have done a better job in appeasing both of these, especially considering that the story of Returnal is sort of back-ended for the gameplay. So Returnal may come across as a narrative game in the same realm as God of War or Last of Us or other PlayStation titles, but it really isn't. Returnal is first and foremost a arcade roguelike shooter. Even now, trying to pin down that genre is going to prove difficult as we go along. And it's not necessarily a pristine AAA narrative experience, so I can imagine that a lot of players were quite upset at how it all turned out. Here I'm facing, in this arena, one of our first, I guess I'll call them mini bosses. These are clearly enemies that stand above the rest, and you'll notice that it had not spawned immediately, but there was a red form that was spawning in, which is a signal to the player that they had better sort out whatever is going on in this room before this enemy appears, so as to be ready for it, quote unquote. And sometimes that happens with me, and then sometimes it doesn't. There was a lot of critique about these types of enemies, especially from Skill Up, where the difficulty of the game was ratcheted quite high due to the fact that these enemies appeared. For the most part, the game was a lot easier to him up until these mini bosses showed up, and then there was a distinct spike in the difficulty. And I think that's a good jumping off point to talk about the difficulty in general, and this is going to be really difficult to explain just because it's going to make me sound really pretentious and make me sound like a good player. I'm in my early 30s, but I have played shooting games all my life, so perhaps that had a lot to say in playing Returnal, but when I played Returnal, I found it to be quite a lot easier. I had a lot of fear going into Returnal because people had been speaking about how punishingly difficult the game was. Sorry, just taking a sip of coffee. But what I discovered was that the game was very generous in its items and very forgiving in certain small ways. So playing on mouse and keyboard, I think, was one of the first reasons that I think the game was a lot easier. It had nothing necessarily to do with my skill right from the beginning, before even being onboarded onto the game's mechanics and the general understanding of how Returnal works. I was able to push through and make considerable progress. I think that's exciting for any mouse and keyboard player who's nervous about Returnal. It just lets you know that Returnal is a little bit more accessible if you're willing to do the work of mouse and keyboard, which is a far more exact method of aiming. I think more importantly, it has to do with reacting. So with a mouse and keyboard, the speed at which you can turn and acquire enemies is so much faster, which I think is really important for a game like Returnal, which uses a bullet hell genre, meaning enemies throw a lot of projectiles at you that are slower moving, and you have to perform some acrobatics in order to dodge them. So I think that's the first reason. The second reason is that I'm playing on a relatively good PC, above average. I'm not going to say it's the best PC, but I'm playing with a Radeon 6700 XT. I'm playing with an AMD Ryzen 7 5800X 3D CPU. I'm playing with 32 gigabytes of RAM. I think at the highest clock speed that an AMD CPU is calibrated for. And I'm playing on an NVMe SSD. And I'm playing, most importantly, on an 144 hertz monitor, which means that I'm able to get a lot more frames into my eyes, which gives me the opportunity to react. And considering that Returnal is a high-paced, fast-paced game, here you're going to see me drop like an idiot. Quite a lot of the platforming gets me into trouble. I think I drop into bottomless pits at a higher than average rate compared to other players. It gets me into trouble often, and it's very frustrating just because the amount of health that I lose and losing adrenaline, which I'll talk about a little later. So anyway, that's another reason why I think that the game was easier, and once I acquired a general sense of the knowledge of the game with the layouts and the behaviors of the weapons, and once I started to gain proficiency with the weapons and unlock traits, I can go through a run of the game, Acts 1 through 6, with a great deal of confidence, and I die roughly 25 to 30% of the time, so it's not as often. Here I guess we should talk about the first boss, which was a very difficult spike in difficulty for a lot of people, the Frike, or Frike. I actually don't know how it's pronounced. This is another Greek name that you'll find in the game. So, compared to other boss fights, I think I performed this one rather admirably here in this run. Again, these runs that I'm in, they're not the best runs, they're just the runs that I recorded. In fact, there have been occasions where I've done a run that has been a lot more successful. Interesting that I'm doing this with the Electron Pylon Driver. Not a very good showcase for how to fight this enemy with a direct weapon. As you can see here, if the Frike is next to a wall, then the amount of damage over time it takes is greatly increased. So I actually find the Frike to be a great boss, and I think the reasons for that are, unlike the game Elden Ring, where bosses can mix and match their movesets to create a very big problem where the player has to intuitively respond on the fly, which is something that I guess I'm doing now. What is great about the Frike is that these movesets, there aren't many. They're very distinct with different colors and different behaviors. There's a pause between all of them, giving you a chance to get some hits in if you're a player who has a hard time shooting and dodging at the same time. And the 3 phases offer only the minorest of differences. So, for example, always in the 3rd phase, like you see there, the Frike only does a melee attack usually once, but in the 2nd phase, he'll do it twice. Now, I think the general strategy for the Frike is simply to run laterally, or to run in a way perpendicular to the way that it's shooting its projectiles. For the most part, this works really well. There are a few occasions, like as you saw right there, where it'll spawn these waves where the player is required to jump as well. There are times when the Frike, when it was shooting those red orbs, will lead the player, which means that the player has to go from moving laterally in one direction to another. And there is that twin beam that it shoots across the ground in the arena, where the player will either have to jump or dodge. So as you can see, there's a kind of a base level requirement for movement and shooting, but to me it's not too challenging, all things considered. And I think that the Frike is one of the best early bosses that I've encountered in a video game. I beat the boss. I don't think I beat the boss the first time. The reason why I didn't beat the boss the first time was because I used the astronaut figure and the replicator. Those are 2 items that allow the player to respawn. And so when I died, I respawned and I went back to the arena from where the replicator was. And when I dropped down, the game had glitched and the Frike would not spawn again for me. So I had to completely restart the run. That was the only time where the game glitched out in a way that I thought was deleterious to the experience. So once you beat the boss of a zone, you are still allowed to maneuver in that zone, which I think is great. It allows the player to sort of make a decision about what they want to encounter, or if there's any last things that they need to get before they move on. Here you'll see that I'm in a containment room. These are kind of wave-based arena rooms that have big bonuses but also test the player in really profound ways. Here I was looking to increase my health, but I was also looking to try and find a different weapon just because I don't find the Electrum Pylon Driver to be fun, having to constantly active reload in this way. And I know that the ruins, or the wastes, I should say, is what it's called, the Crimson Wastes, the next biome that we see in the second game, or second act, excuse me, is one where the Electron Pylon Driver is not necessarily the best weapon to use, given the flatness of the area and the way that a lot of the enemies are aerial. Here I'm using a ground spike weapon against a shielded enemy. So shielded enemies, you have to use your melee attack before encountering them, or before shooting them, so as to disable their shield, which I think is nice. That's something that we can talk about a little later. But here you'll notice that I'm using the Electron Pylon Driver to great effect against this mini-boss once again. I guess I can talk about the combat of Returnal now, which is to say that I think it's a pretty great system. So the range of any encounter is a distinct problem for the player in Returnal. One of the reasons is because when the enemies die, they drop obolites, which are the currency that the player uses throughout the game. In Returnal, obolites are pretty rare to find. And so when the player picks up these obolites, they can spend them on any number of things. They can find them in the world, but the greatest amount of them are dropped by enemies. On the other hand, the enemies will shoot projectiles, and the way that the projectiles function in the game, if you know anything about geometry, the amount of space that you get, the further away you are from the incident where or for the origin of where these projectiles are shot, that means that you have a better chance of dodging it because you have more space. So distance in the game is highly encouraged. So the player has a really distinct contradiction that they have to work through. Either they stay back and they shoot at long ranges and they stay safe, but they miss out on quite a lot of the resources, or they risk it and they get closer. As the player plays the game and they go from amateur to skilled player, they will probably get closer and closer to enemies because they have a lot more confidence in their behaviors, and so they can be a lot more lethal, which means that they are able to get a lot more obolites, which means that they're able to spend those obolites on things. So like a lot of games, the earliest part of the game is actually the most difficult, which I think is, or has always been, a distinct problem in games with any sort of progression, but so too is that the case with arcade games and action games of this sort. As you can see here, I'm trying to ignore these lasers and I get hit right there. Like the platforming, I'm equally not very good when it comes to the lasers, and in fact, as I've played the games, I've gotten more and more impatient. The sound design is so great. There's that moment there with the turret, and just hearing, it's difficult really to describe. If you care about audio and if you care about visual presentation, I think you owe it to yourself to play this game, even if there are some flaws with a lot of the game design. Just hearing things in the distance and sort of reacting to it, and just the way the sounds are designed, it's the soundscape is very crisp and very precise in a way that feels very professional and competent. I just think Returnal is an incredibly robust package that it offers a lot in a deceptive way. I think a lot of players would find that there's just not a lot of content in the game, but I'm more interested in the form of what shape the game takes. And in Returnal, the visuals and the audio, it to me feels like the first next-gen experience that I've played, and that's even the case with Dead Space. I played the Dead Space remake, and it's a beautiful looking game, and it has this incredible sense of place with the USG Ishimura, but it's still a remake, and so it still has a lot of the underpinnings of the 2008 game in its head as you're progressing through. So Returnal, to me, feels like the complete package of what a next-gen experience could be. And that's interesting because Housemarque is not that large of a company, though they were provided a large amount of funding from Sony. And in that way, they were able to punch above their weight in a way that I think is great. And it really has me excited to see what they plan on doing in the future. So here we're in the Crimson Wastes, which obviously is greatly distinct or greatly different from the Overgrown Wastes, or the Overgrown Ruins, I'm sorry. The Overgrown Ruins were a lot more claustrophobic and a lot tighter, and the enemies were a lot more land-based, which means the player was probably a lot more effective in dispatching them and also running away. In the Crimson Wastes, everything is a lot more open, as you can see, so it's a big contrast with range, so it's a little bit more longer range, which is why I wanted something that was not the Electropylon driver. But as you can see also, there's a lot more flying enemies, which can overwhelm the player a lot more given these open spaces. Here we have an artifact, or I don't know what to call them, an installation. This one simply heals the player. There is a mechanic in Returnal where if a player is already at full health, then they receive a bonus to their max health, depending on what they pick up. And it's the same with that Rejuvenator. Here I did not have full health, so instead I was just healed. This is another Metroidvania style area where in the beginning of the game I couldn't go through those. It's sort of like lava. You are damaged if you try to do so. But with these, with the newfound upgrade, I was able to navigate it. So that's one critique I suppose that I can make about the game, is that there's already a lot of backtracking in the beginning of the game, and that's without any of the upgrades. So the ratio between combat and exploring is not handled as well. In shooting games, the concept of action and exploration was first introduced, I suppose, with something like Doom, where there would be plenty of secrets and there would be plenty of ways to explore. And ever since then, shooting games, and especially shooting games in the science fiction genre, tend to follow this, path, or this style of shooting and then exploring and then moving on. I think that Doom handled it perfectly, in the sense that there are a lot of secrets. These secrets occur in the same places over and over again. And so likely in that scenario, if a player is knowledgeable, a player can effectively go through and find secrets very quickly, so their speed in the game is a lot faster. And that's important for the game because as the player gets faster, they feel as though they can make the game more intense of their own accord. Not to mention that there are many difficulty levels that the player can use to tweak the difficulty to their liking. Returnal doesn't have these things. The secrets are randomized. A player can get used to them, but and sort of know where they occur. Oh god. I'm just watching myself play this enemy. And this is one of the harder enemies in the game, so it feels pretty down to the wire that it would choose to spawn the enemy here. So just as a heads up, a lot of the purple energies in the game that I fight cannot be dodged through. They just simply have to be avoided or jumped over. And so anytime you see those purple bands or purple projectiles, just know that the game is increasing the difficulty in that way. So a lot of these things with difficulty and with exploration are handled organically and are very contingent on the layout of the game, and that layout changes. So what ends up happening is that a player will spend a lot of time exploring even without the navigation tools, but what happens is over time there are certain navigation tools which expand the amount of exploration that's possible. Now that's a good thing in the sense that the game becomes easier because there's more pickups and items that the player can access with these exploration tools. Unfortunately, all this takes time, so over time it slowly increases the amount of time spent in each run. Now, to be sure, a player does not have to utilize these new things, but the game is of a sufficient difficulty that I think it is in a player's best interest to do so. Not to mention that a player may find audio log pickups like this increasing their completion rate of the game, which I have still yet to 100%. Likely because some of the tile sets of the game will simply not appear in certain biomes. So a player may go through the game several times, and the biome that they're in, it may need or have an audio log that I need, but the tile set that the audio log occurs in is something that will not happen for some time. So 100%ing the game has turned out to be very frustrating, just because I'm largely waiting and hoping for certain items to appear in certain tile sets. So anyway, all that to say that in the Crimson Waste, you'll see a lot of backtracking and exploration from me, but it's not something I particularly enjoy. Now, a lot of players could present the counter-argument that I should just play the Tower of Sisyphus, which is the combat-based scenario that came with the game later, and is more of a arcade proper experience, where a player ascends floor after floor as the game gets harder and harder, and is really densely focused on combat. So I would respond to that counter argument by suggesting that even in the Tower of Sisyphus, there is some degree of searching for items, and getting artifacts as the player goes along. So that's the first one I'll say. And the second one is that the Tower of Sisyphus doesn't have enough environmental variety, quite like this game does, or quite like the original story narrative does with its 6 biomes. So I much prefer playing through the original game as the game was intended. There you see me falling again. Playing the game as the game intended in this narrative space. And it's here that I guess I could critique that Returnal has a lot of great systems, but they don't necessarily mesh very well, in the sense that I would love for a lot of the elements of the Tower of Sisyphus to be projected here into the game. So at the end of each run of the original game with its 6-act structure, it would have been great to be able to go through all 6 acts and to get some kind of score at the end, like the Tower of Sisyphus. And this score would be predicated on speed, lethality, maybe some of the thorough exploration of objects and items, maybe the amount of health lost, that sort of thing. Maybe choosing not to use the astronaut figure or the replicator so as to respond. So I think in that sense, the original game could have been like the Tower of Sisyphus, but they chose instead to make it more of a narrative experience, which I think was a mistake. Here we're about to face the second boss, Ixion. I think Ixion is probably my favorite boss to fight for its behavior. I think the third boss is my favorite for spectacle, which we'll come to. Ixion feels like the Radon fight of the game. Radon is a fight in Elden Ring that has quite a large scope and has some similar behaviors to what you're seeing here. Ixion is quite a degree more difficult than Frike, in the sense that the Ixion enemy is flying all about the space, so a character sort of has to think about maneuvering in the space while looking up and looking around, which is a very different thing to ask the player than what came before. The Ixion will fire projectiles that are slower and faster, so it sort of tests the player's timing, or sense of timing. As you can see, I don't have to do necessarily a lot of dodging as of yet. One of the things I like about the game is Ixion, whenever Ixion drops down, always drops down in the center, so it's a bit of consistency for the player. Here is a rare projectile, this wave that is sent out. I don't really see that very often later in the game. Here Ixion is doing what Radon does, flying in and creating some issues. As you can see here, I tend to do okay as a skilled player. As long as the player is sticking to the edge of wherever Ixion comes in, they should be okay. As you can see here, I'm moving just perpendicularly, learning from what I had before with the Frike. So as you can see, even just moving laterally for a lot of these projectiles does okay. But then the Ixion will send something like this, and if the player has enough distance, thanks to my Hollow Seeker weapon, I can maneuver through those without having to dodge. Earlier I spoke about the shotgun weapon not being a great weapon for the game, and that's because there's a distinct difference between the weapons that are good against enemies that you fight in the world and weapons that are good against bosses that you fight at the end, which I think is a pretty large problem. So the Spitmaul Blaster as a shotgun is very powerful against certain enemies that you're fighting in the overworld, but I'd be hard pressed to see how the Spitmaul Blaster could be good in this scenario, where you need to maintain enough distance so as to give yourself time for the dodge to recharge if you're going to use that, but also to provide enough space with the projectiles that you're up against as you're fighting. The Spitmaul Blaster as a shotgun is a semi-automatic weapon, whereas the Hollow Seeker I can just hold down the mouse, so I don't necessarily have to think too much about this weapon in particular. That's not true of the Rot Gland Lobber, which I have to reload each and every time I fire it. But that weapon is so distinctly powerful that it sort of counteracts this behavior by just being very good. The Hollow Seeker is a very consistent damaging weapon, but without the Portal Beam, which is one of the traits, it can be a really low damaging weapon overall. So here I'm sacrificing damage output with consistency. Here things are getting pretty down to the wire. I'm about to enter a low amount of health. I'm on the last phase of Ixion, so as you can see that there is this tense feeling as I'm shooting, as I'm fighting. But luckily the Ixion goes down fairly easily. Now, one thing that's interesting about Returnal is, for any veteran player, you might be wondering why I'm fighting these bosses at all. In Returnal, once you have defeated a boss, you don't necessarily have to fight that boss again. So here we're going to transition back to the first biome, and this is a separate playthrough, and you can actually, as long as you unlock certain navigation tools like the grappling hook, you can go from one biome to the next without having to fight the boss at all. I wanted to fight the bosses just so you could see them in action as a benefit to the gameplay aspect of this commentary. So even though we're losing quite a bit of the narrative of Returnal by playing after all of the story elements have played through, you at least get to see some of the gameplay elements, such as the bosses. So here we're going straight from Biome 1 to Biome 3, which I think is great for any returning player. They have a lot of control over what run they choose to have in the future. And here we're going to the Citadel. And compared to the Crimson Wastes, I enjoy the Citadel quite a lot more as far as its design and its look. I find that the Crimson Wastes is one of my least favorite. I love the Overgrown Ruins for its look. I don't necessarily like it for the way that it plays. The Derelict Citadel is the place where I like the look and I like the way it plays, both at the same time. I just love the backdrop of the spaces in the distance. There's this huge sense of space and scale to these zones. Navigating these spaces is really great. It's really quite a lot faster, so backtracking does not feel as problematic. You can use a grappling hook to get through a lot of places, and the secrets that are in these areas are a lot quicker to find, in my opinion. The enemies have incredible sound design and an incredible look to them. They have this mechanical, sort of technological feel to them. The ruins have an old look on the outside, very monumental, but underneath there are these wires. So I think it has a great amount of design in its minutia and in its sense of scale. When I got to this biome, the first time I was just sort of in awe of the art design and the way that I felt like I was embedded into this city, despite the fact that Returnal is the sort of experience that is pretty similar throughout, regardless of the art design. Quite a lot of the secrets in the game are done very intelligently. As you saw there, I had to use the grappling hook in just such a way as to get leverage, get enough height, so that when I dodged, I was just able to get to some of those containers that look out of reach. Unfortunately, that's sort of where I can start talking about the item synergies, and I'm going to be spending a long time speaking about this, so I apologize if it's not quite as diegetic to what's happening on screen. And if you're not watching and you're just listening, then you get the best of both worlds, I suppose. So the items of Returnal leave a lot to be desired, in the sense that in a roguelike, what a player is typically looking for is the existence of item synergies. Item synergies are simply a way of saying that two items taken together have such benefits as to be greater than the sum of their parts. So that's not to say that synergies do not exist in Returnal. In fact, I can give you an example now of some of the best runs that I've had. So in the game, you pick up what are called parasites, and parasites stick to Celine's body, and they offer a benefit at the cost of something. So one benefit is that the fixing of malfunctions gives Celine an added ability, or that fixing malfunctions increases Celine's maximum health. So for those who are not aware, malfunctions occur when a player picks up an item that has been compromised in some way. There's a particular term for it that I can't think of now. So when you pick up these items, such as mostly the purple items, or open a purple container, there is a chance that the player will receive a malfunction. These malfunctions hurt you in a certain way, but can be fixed if you complete the objective that is shown on screen. So one such example of a malfunction would be that you get hurt whenever you pick up items. But you can fix this malfunction if you kill enemies. Now, to me, that's a pretty easy one. There are some cases where fixing a malfunction is quite a lot more difficult, such as finding an artifact. And artifacts aren't necessarily known to be common throughout the world, so they can be a little difficult. So it's a risk. But I personally found that if I can get a hold of the malfunction item, parasite, where fixing a malfunction gives you a random combat ability, or fixing a malfunction gives you more maximum health, what ends up happening is a sort of runaway tactic by the player, where they will try to pick up as many items as possible so as to get many malfunctions. And once they fix these malfunctions, the combat ability and the max health is here to stay. And it's sort of a runaway train moment where the player is able to reach escape velocity of the game's systems and become so powerful that many of the enemies do not really know how to respond to a Celine of that power. So to any fan of the roguelike genre, that's a good thing. Having what's called a godlike run is very important for a player to feel empowered, and it gives them a memory that exists in their hippocampus that they can rely on for when they plan the future, because they want to go back to that moment of feeling like they are in a god run. Now, what's great about a god run in a roguelike is that it's not the end of the story. In really good roguelikes like Risk of Rain 2, the existence of a godlike run may take you farther or may allow you to do different things, but the game slowly becomes more difficult over time. And so a godlike run is typically not a godlike run for very long. To be sure, there are certain objectives that a player can complete that is not just beating the game, which I love about Risk of Rain 2. In Risk of Rain 2, there are several different end states, and there are several different ways that the player can play the game if they happen to be in a godlike run. Returnal doesn't necessarily have that, so even when I was in a godlike run, I still felt as though the game was limiting me, and even when I felt I was in a godlike run, Returnal ends in the same way over and over again, so it just helped me to get to the end faster. So all that to say that there is a possibility for synergies to exist in Returnal, but 90% of the time, I would say, the economy of Returnal is not designed for this kind of godlike run experience. So if we have a spectrum that we could see in our heads, and on the left is the arcade genre, and on the right is the roguelike genre, then Returnal sits far more in the arcade genre than in the roguelike genre, in the sense that Housemarque since this was their first foray into roguelikes, it seemed as though they were very uncomfortable with the kind of power that they wanted to give to the player. And so they often held back quite a lot on what was available to them at any given time. And this controlling aspect of the game, for some players, was likely very frustrating. So one way that they attempted to control the player is that every parasite or every item can, well, I guess not every item or every pickup, but most of the time they're tinged with malignance. That was the word I was looking for earlier. And so those malfunctions are designed to hold the player back or provide a risk-reward system for the player. So that's one aspect. Many of the consumables of the game, once they're used, they can't be used anymore, so they're not necessarily an ability, they're just simply a contingent item. The third thing is the existence of proficiency in the weapons. So over time, a player can unlock traits, and these traits bolster weapons in certain ways. So for example, on this Holoseeker that I'm using now, there might be the retarget ability, or there might be serrated projectiles, or there might be a portal gun, or there might be waves. And these change the feeling or the use of a weapon in pretty large, substantial ways. And weapons in the game drop randomly, so you don't know necessarily what weapon you're likely to expect in the future. But in a roguelite way, there is some progression in the game that you are unlocking different traits that you can use later. Now, at first this seems like a good thing, because you want to have a sense of progression overall in the game, so you don't feel as though your efforts are being wasted were you to die, which is a very arcade experience. In an arcade game, if you die, you go back to the beginning, and you don't really have a lot to say about what you've gained except for knowledge and skill. So Returnal tries to lean into that, but unfortunately, the arcadiness of the game clashes with the roguelike aspect of the game heavily when it comes to the weapons. So I've mentioned before that the Holoseeker and the Rot Gland Lobber are the two best weapons in the game, and I can say that with a great amount of confidence. Once I found those weapons, I hardly used any of the others, and I think this cuts deep into the arcade experience of Returnal, and I think that the roguelite experience actually sort of poisoned a lot of the experience of playing the game, because I was simply looking for just the Holoseeker and just the Rot Gland Lobber. The reason for this has to do with its roguelite set of progression. So There are traits that the weapons have, such as bonus damage. I guess those aren't traits, those are more stats, because the traits that I'm talking about are these unlockable features. And it just so happens that these unlockable features, these traits, are not equal. So the assault rifle and the pistol both have a great amount of traits that make them a little different compared to other weapons, and that's good to be distinct. I like that each weapon behaves differently in Returnal, but unfortunately those traits are just not as good as the traits found on the Hollowseeker and the Rotgland Labber, especially against bosses and especially in later acts. So what that means is that the game is trying to offer a sense of progression, but Housemarque did not consider the ramifications or the implications of having that set of progression systems, how it affects the player the further on they go into a run. And what I would have preferred for me personally is for Housemarque to focus solely in the arcade spectrum, or in the arcade genre, which means that every weapon should have been balanced for damage and traits and behaviors, and that each weapon would present a contingent circumstance based on how the player feels when they're fighting, and with the knowledge of what bosses they were going to face in the future. So that is to say that perhaps in the first biome, since it's so close quarters, it would be very beneficial to find and pick up a Dreadbound. The Dreadbound weapon is a pretty cool weapon where every time you fire, the projectile returns like a boomerang once it makes contact with an enemy. That means that the closer you happen to be with the Dreadbound, when you are shooting, the quicker the weapon gets back to you, the faster fire rate that you have, which means that in a close range biome like the Overgrown Ruins, you're highly incentivized to use something like the Dreadbound. Unfortunately, I can't say the same thing for the Frike, which means that a player, when playing, is going to want to use the Dreadbound for a specific amount of time and then switch over before encountering the boss. Now that's something that an advanced player or an experienced player would know. But if a player had a certain amount of skill with the Dreadbound and knew of the Frike enemy or the boss and how it behaved, then perhaps there could be a case made, if the damage tables were balanced enough or tweaked enough, that a player would want to use the Dreadbound against the Frike. I just don't think the weapons in Returnal behave like that. I think the Hollowseeker and the Rotgland Labber are dominant strategies that I really think cut into the largest critique that I can make in Returnal about the differences between the arcade genre and the roguelike genre. It has me excited to see what they do in the future, if they can gain a better understanding of how to use the roguelike genre to their benefit. But here, for the most part, it seems as though a lot of the item economies and the weapon economies sort of clash more than they benefit each other in the feel of the game. It's not to say that the game is overall bad. I think that, like I said, the presentation of Returnal is unparalleled. It's just, this commentary here does not do it justice when it comes to the way that the game feels and the way that the game looks. So I definitely think that it more than justifies its experience to be played instead of simply watched. Here you're seeing a bizarre episode where, and this has happened a couple times, where things have been out of reach, whether it's enemies or items. I was not aware that that was a bottomless drop-off, because I thought the enemy being there would mean that there would be some secret passage. So there are times in the game communicates rather poorly what the player is likely to expect on the minimap. Something else that we can talk about is the culmination of what happens in Act 3. So all this time, Celine is looking for a signal called White Shadow. Let me take a drink of coffee real quick. Okay, so White Shadow is the presence of some kind of signal. Like a lot of things in the game, White Shadow has a metaphorical meaning as well. When Celine drops into the water after her car crash with her child in the car as well. When she looks up at the moon from the perspective of the water, she sees the moon with its refracted light, in a sense, a kind of white shadow. If you don't know much about Greek mythology, Selene has, as a name, bears some relationship to the moon. And her son, or her child, I'm actually not quite sure on the gender of the child, is named Helios, the sun. Hyperion, the boss that you fight in Biome 4, I believe, is the father of Selene and Helios, the sun and the moon. So this is, I suppose, what I mean when I suggest that the Greek mythology of the game invites some strange contradictions, where the way that the names are used in Greek mythology compared to the way that they're used here, you're not exactly sure if Selene are mother and child or siblings. And I'm assuming that, of course, that Selene has a child named Helios, although Selene throughout the game does not quite interact directly with Helios. It's more so metaphorized over the course of the story as the ship Helios. So I'm not quite sure what Selene's relationship is, and I'm going to assume that it's mother and child, just the way that it's presented in some of the cutscenes, especially the final cutscene. To me, I think is definitive proof of that relationship. But the use of Greek names, I think, is one of those attempts to make the game universal for quite a lot of the Western world. I think it's a mistake. I think it invites a lot more confusion than it does a sense of gravitas or a sense of resonance. So I think it's sort of a problem. Compared to the biomes of the Crimson Wastes and the Overgrown Ruins, as you can see, everything is pulled back even more to allow for greater range and greater verticality, which I think is all pretty nice, a nice benefit. But I tend to like the interactions of the enemies in this area. In my opinion, Biome 3 is much more difficult than Biome 2 or Biome 1. I think the astronaut mini-boss is incredibly difficult to come to terms with, and as you can see here in this late game experience, I still don't quite have a grasp on how to dodge many of the astronauts' attacks. As I'm watching now, I notice that I should be using cover a lot more, but I don't. Here you can see these eyes providing watch over certain spaces, especially on this bridge as we make our way through. There you notice that I used the alt-fire attack of a shield breaker to break that particular enemy's shield, so I didn't have to go in closer for a kill. I think that's a pretty cool contingent use of it, where there are these eye watchers in the sky who will shoot me if I get close. So it's not really a very good position where I can get up close and shoot. The pathway to them is quite narrow and quite linear, so there's no way that I can flank and get around. And there is a particular issue of other enemies being there as well, so I would feel overcrowded if I was to get in close. So the shield breaker alternative fire is a great example of a contingent use of an item in the geography of the place. That is where Returnal stands out best, in my opinion. It presents a huge complexity of items and allows the player to interact with those in a way that introduces knowledge and skill combined. And it's not something that I remembered doing as I was playing, but here, when I'm contingently watching the commentary, I'm able to realize it
and remark on it. So kudos to Returnal for doing that. Here's another scenario where it's not easy to get to that turret from there, quite linear. And again, I'm using the shield breaker. So it seems that I luckily used the right weapon at the right time, even if I didn't necessarily know it. Anyway, I think in the third biome, I spent some time, or I guess the player spends their time trying to unlock that bridge that I crossed. And now I'm ascending to fight the final boss of the first half of the game. And I guess this is a place where I can sort of critique what Returnal does with its first half and its second half. If you've played the game, you know that you don't play a single run all the way through. And the game is split into two halves. There's the first half, which is Acts 1, 2, and 3, which take place in the overgrown ruins, the Crimson Wastes, and the Echoing Citadel. And then you have the second act, which takes place in the Echoing Ruins, the Fractured Wastes, and the Abyssal Scar. I suppose one of the largest critiques I can make about the game is this split between the two. Once you defeat the first half, or once you complete the first half, you have to effectively go back to the start. You lose all of your items, you lose all of your weapons, and you're playing the game again. I think this is a big problem just because it proves, I think, that Housemarque was unwilling to let you go to explore the items and to really bolster your character. I would have rather had a method for playing all 6 acts in a row with the stats on hand. I can see why they didn't, in the sense that I think that would have been too much for the systems of the game to bear. If I couldn't get an Act 1 to Act 6 narrative playthrough all the way through, I would have loved to have had a score-based system like the Tower of Sisyphus, but in the game proper, where Acts 1 through Act 3 you would be given a score, and then Acts 3 through 6 you would be given a score, and players in the future would forever be chasing after their spot in the leaderboards with this sort of system. To be sure, there would be cheaters that would be on the leaderboards that would kind of compromise maybe sort of the larger spots. And that's okay. Just because players who are veterans would be able to know what would be an unlikely score and what would be a more likely score. But in any case. So I think that's a rather large problem. It's not as if when you play a game like Noida, or play a game like Dead Cells, or play a game like Risk of Rain, the game stops you in the middle of a run and resets everything that you have in order to do the run again. And to me, I think this was a problem between the two aspects of narrative and gameplay, and I think narrative won out, and I think that makes the gameplay suffer as a result. Here you'll notice that I am getting really close to dying, and I'm not altogether sure if I had an astronaut figurine, and I'm not sure if I've activated a replicator. So it's unclear to me. Oh, I picked up a Rockland Lobber right before the final boss, which is going to be a huge benefit. The Rotgland Lobber, when it leaves its trail, a lot of the traits of the weapon are based on the behaviors of that trail. And for the most part, all of the traits of the Lobber are quite good. Now, something I will say is that the Lobber is a weapon that's not available to the player the first time they play. One of the maneuvering tools that you get in Returnal is the chance to see these invisible blue orbs. You may have seen it already, especially in the Crimson Wastes, the second biome. And you can effectively shoot those, and they will reveal platforms that you can jump onto that were invisible before. Even if you know where those platforms are, I don't think that you could jump on them, so they appear in a way that they were disappeared, or they didn't exist before. So in the first biome, you can shoot one of these orbs and you get to these platforms, and once you pick up the Rockland Lobber at the top of these platforms, it unlocks the weapon for future runs. So if it's any credit to the developers, I think they were aware of the strength of the Lobber, and they advocated for waiting and making it an unlock for the future to make some of the progression of the game a lot easier. Which means to some extent that they know that they can create a system where a player can prove mastery once, like fighting the bosses, and then they create a scenario for a player to ignore the bosses in the future. And the same goes for this Rockland Lobber weapon. I think this is interesting largely because it invites a lot of conflict into the feeling of the run as a player goes along. So we've talked about that with the sense of backtracking with these maneuvering options. But I had not really considered until now the easier difficulty as a player goes along. I think many of the spikes in difficulty of Returnal aren't where the game thinks they are. That is to say that I actually don't think that the final act, Act 6, is all that difficult. And I don't necessarily think that the bosses in the second half of the game are all that difficult either. There are certain moments that I think are more difficult than others that don't feel as though that they are linear. I think they can be, or even logarithmic. I think that it comes and goes, I suppose. And I think this is a distinct problem with video games in general, where in reality, the beginning of a game should be its easiest moments, and then it gets slowly more difficult over time. Now, there are some aspects of Returnal that get more difficult. I think that the Fractured Wastes biome is one of the most difficult, but on the other hand, the Fractured Wastes biome does not have a boss. So you'll have to decide for yourself whether that's a more or less difficult area in aggregate as a net gain or a net loss in terms of its difficulty. For the scope of the first half of the game, we can say that Overgrown Ruins could be easier because of its close range, or we could say it is more difficult because a lot of those enemies are close range enemies that will do melee attacks. And if a player feels claustrophobic and doesn't really know how to dodge the projectiles, we could say that it's more difficult. So I'm not sure. I guess the jury is still out when it comes to difficulty in Returnal. Personally, I really don't like how the game gets easier and easier. I was sort of hoping, and this occurred, I suppose, about 10 to 15 hours in. Returnal is one of those games where when I started playing and up to about the midpoint or completing the game the first time, about 10 to 15 hours in, I considered Returnal to be one of the best games I had ever played, certainly. It was a game that I felt was perfectly designed for me. Here I'll take a break talking about the aspect of difficulty in the game to talk about the Nemesis fight, which I want to give this all the time that it's due, just because the Nemesis fight is easily the best fight in Returnal. I think it has the greatest amount of scope. I think that the scale of the fight, the music design, especially once it starts to hit that marching kind of rhythmic drum beat here in the second and third phase, I think is just an incredible experience. So here the boss will split and recombine in other ways later. The way that the very platforms that you're on begin to shake and to separate is very different from any of the other fights most of the other boss fights in Returnal are quite bare. You're in a circular arena, and the enemy is more often than not relatively stationary. Now, to be sure, the Nemesis is not moving, but I think that this is the first time that we've had a boss stay still, and I think the presence of these moving platforms helps to counteract the fact that the Nemesis is not moving. Even though that this boss is epic in every single way, I actually think that this boss is one of the easiest to fight, even though I'm doing a poor job demonstrating that. Quite a lot of the attacks are easy to dodge, and there's enough distance where if the player has a weapon like I do, it's easy enough to trickle down the damage in a safe way. Here you can see that I'm in a pretty bad way as far as health is concerned, so it's time to nut up or shut up, as they say, and either defeat the boss or die trying. So, as you can see, this is a commentary where I've cut out all of my previous deaths. You likely can see what's about to happen. Interestingly, the Nemesis's third phase is not a very difficult one. As you can see, I'm still doing damage even from this far back. And when I use the grapple hook, I can effectively use it as a sort of dodge through these projectiles or around these projectiles. But there will not be a moment where the scale of a boss is quite like this. Not even the last boss. If I'd had my way, I would take the Nemesis boss and I would have shifted it to the final boss at the end of the second act, or the second half of the game, excuse me, the sixth act. Why they did this, I don't know. I speculate it's because that the developers, Housemarque, really wanted to drive home the sinking feeling that Celine will never escape this place. So, at the end of the first half of the game, you're generally under the assumption that once you reach the White Shadow, and once you've defeated the Nemesis boss, that the game is effectively over. You witness a cutscene, which I'm sure we're about to witness now, where Celine returns. There's a great big news segment about what Celine experienced, sort of embedding the idea into our heads that this takes place in real life. And she returns to Earth, and it seems as though she spends or plays out the rest of her days having conquered this fear and having experienced a truly alien world, and has come back. In reality, this is all a facade, and once Celine reaches old age and is dead and buried, she wakes up to return to this moment. So if you've ever seen any time loop narrative, there's typically a moment in the movie or the TV show or the game that tries to get into the player's head and presents a sort of, I don't want to call it a straw man argument, but presents the idea that exists outside of the viewer's head that they hadn't thought of, and reminds the player that the strictures or the conceit of the time loop exists for all time, and that there is no escape, at least in the way that the character thinks of it. So this occurs typically between the first act and the second act, where a player is getting accustomed, or a viewer is getting accustomed to the form of the movie or the game. And so it is usually after this where the character will undergo a sort of psychological breakthrough. So one example of this is in Groundhog Day, where effectively Bill Murray kills himself by jumping off of a very high space, and he comes to the realization that nothing in his immediate way of thinking works. This happens as well with a movie called Palm Springs, where Andy Samberg has tried everything, quote unquote. And the other character, who the love interest of Andy Samberg, I forget her name. she attempts to drive as far as she can away from the place where the time loop begins and tries to stay awake. But as soon as she falls asleep, she returns back to where she started. So this sort of, I would call it a coming to Jesus moment, though I'm not particularly religious in that way. It's just a great idiom for speaking to the fact that the reality that the characters find themselves in is a lot more dire than they realized, and they're going to have to take a different tact. This to me was the ultimate signal to the player that this is not a story that takes place in outer reality, but is a psychological story that takes place in Celine's head, because how on earth would a player be able to justify Celine's entire life lived out in the world in reality in the way that it is, only to die and then return to this particular moment, unless it was a grand aspect of denial. So anyway, that's the first half of the game. I think that as a whole, the first half is just an incredible experience. We have talked about some distinct problems with the mechanics behind the gameplay, but that doesn't detract from the feeling of the gameplay itself, which I think is responsive and quick and very precise. And I think that the visual and audio systems that they spent so much time creating, the art, the design, it's all very robust. And like an idiot, I fell once again. So if you learn anything from this commentary, you can see that I'm not a very great player, quite clumsy, and I still managed to complete the game many times. So the game is quite forgiving and quite rewarding, and quite generous at times, which is something that I would not have expected. I consider Elden Ring to be a much more difficult game. So take that for what you will. Here we are in the second set of ruins in the daytime. Out of all the places where I encountered performance problems, I would say that the ruins here in the fourth biome are where the problems occurred the most. When trying to think about why, I had overheard Housemarque talk about Climax Studios, who brought us the port, mentioned something about the way that meshes were generated. Here you're going to see me die rather quickly. So, as you can see, the combination of a bad series of bad luck, I guess, with that spawning enemy, as difficult as it was with a low weapon, the pistol, the starting pistol, and the stupid behavior of me jumping from one place to another, I can still get into certain scenarios where I die. Now, luckily, this is in Biome 4, so it wasn't much of a detraction. But I hope you can see through that little small experience how a death might occur. So there's something that is going on with the textures and the meshes and the way that they're generated. These ruins are particularly dense. There's quite a lot of trees. I think also, out of all the biomes, this one has a great amount of possibilities for where Celine or the player can go next. Wow, getting some really bad artifacts when it comes to the recording of this. As you can see, the fog especially is flickering in and out. I saw that a little bit in the Citadel. That's interesting. So anyway, here there are a lot of places that I can go, and there are no loading screens in Returnal, which means that Returnal is loading on the fly. It's creating these assets as the player goes through, but it doesn't know what assets to create until the character and the player have committed in a certain direction. Now, unfortunately, in this biome, there are a lot of directions that the player can go. I have the feeling that the loading the way that it's done in this biome is a lot more cloistered compared to the other areas. So I've had a lot of hitching, and there is a single tile that hopefully I can show later on in this where the hitching occurs the most, and that's where it's kind of a hub area, and there are spokes that can go in many different directions. Here I have the coil spine shredder, I believe. The coil spine shredder is a weapon that behaves very similarly to the rot gland lobber in the sense that it has 1 or 2 shots before it has to be reloaded, and it's a single fast-moving beam or projectile. And compared to the rot gland lobber, it's one of those cases where the weapons are so close in behavior that I end up never, for the most part, never choosing the coil spine, unless I'm in this case where I start out with the pistol and I'm just looking for any excuse for a weapon that is not the pistol so as to get more traits and so as to get that higher progression or proficiency that the weapons have when they're unlocked. So anyway, going back to the difficulty, there is a moment between the first half and the second half of Returnal where the experience does spike. And certainly the second half of the game is harder than the first, but one of my biggest problems is that overall, as the player is collecting all of these items and things, the game is getting easier. And I know that that is sort of the case with every game, right? I mean, we're talking about the way that the mind works when it comes across new information, which is generally very difficult. And a lot of this takes place in the frontal lobes, which require a lot of energy and a lot of calories and a lot of thinking. But over time, as a person acquires a certain amount of skill in a game, that starts to get back into the hippocampus. In other words, it becomes memory. In the case of maybe a game, it becomes muscle memory. So literally, we're talking about the use of memory to overcome certain challenges, where once certain aspects of a game embed itself into memory, we can start to focus on more advanced, more complex problems, more complex problem solving, or a better use of skill. And so this is why practice leads to better performance. Now, there are certain ways of practice that are better than others. Here you can see me testing out a weapon to see if it's better. And as you know, I like the Hollow Seeker. And so in this scenario, it just shreds through enemies. And so in Returnal, it was sort of, like any other game, I guess, for the player who's committed to getting better and to undergoing deliberate practice, meaning that they're actively thinking about how they're playing the game. It stands to reason that the game will become easier in that respect. I think one of the problems that I had with the game, and the reason why I'm trying to mince very precisely about what I'm speaking about, is that I think Returnal didn't manage to keep up the difficulty with the player in a way that was satisfying. And since we're in the second act, I guess I can spend some time speaking about that. And since I, as the player here, have no idea what I'm doing, trying to get from one place to another, it's very clear that I'm totally lost on how to reach this particular chest underneath, even though I've played this tile set. So I think it was just a lapse of judgment as I was playing, because I know that from here you have to drop down and then dodge. I guess I just didn't understand quite where I needed to drop down. Oh, now I'm understanding. Great. So anyway, in the second act, in the second half of the game, what you're going to find is that the bosses, boss 4 and boss 6, there is no boss in boss 5, behave in very similar ways to the Nemesis, in the sense that they're very static. They stay still, and they shoot projectiles at the enemy. And this is very different from the transition from the Frike to the Ixion to the Nemesis fight. In my opinion, I think that the Hyperion boss, the boss that we're about to fight, and the boss from the Abyssal Scar, boss 6, should have been combined, or should have been rethought of entirely to be bosses that move around and that also shoot projectiles. Unfortunately, it wasn't. And I think in that way, the player can rely on what they did with the Nemesis fight. Now, there are some twists with those two fights that make them sort of distinct from one another, which I'll talk about when I get there. But I just don't think it was enough to really challenge the player as they got better and better. Or here we go. So this is the place where the 20th Century House occurs. As you can see, I've exhausted all the narrative aspects of the game. So that is when the house turns to stone, which I think is a great metaphor to Celine, that the house was a metaphor that existed in her head and is not necessarily something that appears in this world. Now, that, of course, could mean that Celine really is out here in a type of reality, and that Atropos is a real external place to go to, and that Celine has also some psychological issues that she is projecting onto the world. But I still stand by my opinion that all of this is going on in Celine's head. So, anyway, here, as you can see, there are moments when I can go directly and fight the boss, but here I wanted to show you some other aspects of the world, but I also wanted to improve my character. Like I said before, the entirety of the act reset once I died. But also, if a player were not to die, these aspects, or the benefits to a character, reset anyway, and so I felt as though I was forced to make my character better by exploring the world a little more. It would have been great if a player could have kept everything from the first half of the game and could have just flown directly to the boss as a way to challenge them and as a way to get perhaps a higher score if the game was keeping score. It's just one of those things where we have an iron triangle of arcade and roguelike and narrative, and I think that the end result was not greater than the sum of its parts. It actually detracted, where a player focused on gameplay would have wanted a lot of the things that were in Tower of Sisyphus to be included in the main game, but were not there. A lot of the ways that the Tower of Sisyphus functions is not gameplay-y enough, and certainly a lot of the economy of the game does not benefit itself towards the Tower of Sisyphus with its benefits and drawbacks. And certainly the narrative aspects of the game are, like I said, back-ended, even though I'm speaking extemporaneously about them as if there's a lot of metaphor here and a lot of symbolism. I do think it is metaphorized to such an extent that it caused, like I said, it caused confusion with players who were playing for narrative because they wanted something a little bit more explicit, and for those who are focused on the gameplay, they don't really care. So it kind of exists in a space that no one exists in. I suppose this is a good time to talk about some of the other items in the economy of Returnal. You notice there that I picked up a suit artifact. Or I suppose it's not an artifact, it's a stat augment, excuse me. So to be sure, there are artifacts, which are items like the astronaut figurine that a player can pick up as they go along. And these are unquestionable benefits. They offer no drawbacks, and they typically provide a certain benefit to behavior, even to dying. They can bring a player back. Now, there are also other items that are known as stat augments. So in Returnal, there are a certain set of stats. One is protection, which is sort of a base level defense against enemy attacks. So if you take damage, you take less damage if you have a benefit to your protection. Another one is weapon damage. So by picking these up, you can do a percentage damage higher than you could before. And there's also something called repair efficiency, which is, in all likelihood, how much health you gain back from items that give you health back. So it's quite a bit more. So all of these aspects are things that Sling can gain over time. And I don't necessarily think there is a limit to these. In the sense that they can just keep gaining weapon damage over time. You can keep gaining protection over time. These percentages can just get higher and higher. Now, sometimes throughout the game, these stat augments are provided free of charge, meaning as long as a player can find where these stat augments are, they can simply activate them and get them. So as a result, exploration is highly encouraged because you never know when you're going to find these stat augments for free. In other cases, they will present stat augments with a matter of choice with two of them, and it's very rare for the player to have enough obolites to get both of them. I suppose a more advanced player who has gotten close to enemies and picked up more obolites could presumably get both if they wanted to, so that still does exist. But it's likely rare, so a player is instead given the choice to incentivize one or the other. And then finally, and this is an awkward aspect of the game, there are moments in the game when a player is first playing the game where there is some narrative object, and usually these are keys. So there are keys that are used to unlock plenty of locked doors throughout the game. However, similar, I suppose, to like Legend of Zelda, there are boss keys, and once you find these boss keys, you can access the vault, is what it's called, which is just where the boss is located. Interestingly enough, speaking of Zelda, the vault is a red door that has an upside-down triangle in the shape of a Triforce. So I'm not sure if that was a direct reference, but I think that's pretty cool. So once a player picks up these boss keys, they no longer need them in the future. They can just go straight to the boss, which I think was smart. But it raises the question of, what do you put in that spot where the boss key was? And Housemarque could have decided between having nothing there, which meant that once a player realized that there was no reason to explore to collect the place where that boss key occurred again, that would mean that the player would not explore to the furthest extent of these regions. It would simply explore maybe just the very closely surrounding areas of the boss before going to fight. Now, I think that this is a bad incentive, and I think Housemarque did too, but instead they decided to place, oftentimes, either artifacts or stat augments. And I think that's a good idea in theory, because you want to provide a very big, real, unquestionably good reason for the player to go out that far to collect those things. So, for me personally, anytime I saw a stat augment and I had a choice between two and one of them was weapon damage, I always chose weapon damage. Anytime there was a single choice of weapon damage, I would find enough obolites, no matter what it took, even if I had to sell certain things or get rid of certain things, and I would come back and I would get weapon damage. And the reason for this is probably not surprising to any veterans of video games. Weapon damage is typically the untold dominant strategy in video games. The reason being is because the longer an enemy is on screen, the longer the enemy has a chance to damage the player, which means that even though a player could incentivize maybe their own running speed to be faster, it has no bearing on the benefits to the player against an enemy. But if a player can dispatch an enemy much quicker, that means that the chances for being damaged by that enemy is a lot more rare, or is a lot less likely. So, especially in a game like Returnal, where enemies are shooting projectiles, a player is highly incentivized to get weapon damage so as to dispatch enemies quickly. So I always chose that. Now, this constant playing of the game and unlocking these boss keys and unlocking progression systems means that in the future, now that a player has gotten rid of boss keys, they basically have more choice when it comes to stat augments and artifacts, just because simply there are more of them in the world. In fact, I'm going to stop here and talk about this enemy. This is a nice touch where this might be a long conversation. So in previous Housemarque games, they have usually been done in a top-down perspective, which has made the transparency of where enemy attacks are at any given time very easy because you can see all the information on screen. But Returnal is different in the sense that it's a third-person game. I think being in third person instead of first person was the best way that they could have done this, because you need to see where Celine is in the world in order to dodge projectiles. So dodging projectiles in first person would be quite difficult because you're not intuitively sure where your legs are, where your shoulders are. You just have a general sense of where your head is, which can be tweaked with things like field of view. So the game had to create a way for you to see what's not in the camera, what's not in the mise-en-scène, which is just your perspective and what you're seeing. So there are two things that I saw when fighting that boss. One of them is that there's a directionality near Celine's head, which is purple and kind of gives you a vague direction that, hey, there are projectiles coming towards you and it's from this direction. You don't necessarily know how far away they are, but you have a general sense of where they're coming from. The second is that when that particular enemy is about to teleport and strike you, there is a red trail that emanates from Celine's body, giving you a sense of what direction it's coming from, and it also lets you know that, hey, if this red trail shows up, that means that the melee attack is imminent. So I think it's a nice touch, but I also think that Housemarque's previous games have been better as top-down games, just because these methods only work so often. There are plenty of cases where a player can take damage and they don't feel like it is deserved simply because they had no idea that it was coming. Throughout the game, much of the sound design is meant to signal to the player that there is an enemy there, and oftentimes before an enemy attacks, as you can hear there with that turret, the turret will emit a signal before shooting so as to warn the player. Now, in a complex fight sequence, more complex than this, it is altogether unclear whether the player is going to hear that. But I still think it's a nice touch that it exists. I just think that this is all done expediently so as to give the player information that the player would already have had if it was a top-down game. I think in a AAA experience, if a game was going to release and try to be the killer app for the PlayStation 5, it's very difficult to pass off the idea of a top-down shooter as being the killer app. I don't think that it's impossible. I think that that would be great. It's just that typical game players are looking for a more robust experience, and that usually means first or third person in a 3D environment. I think it's a shame that it has to be that way, but that's just sort of the laws of the land in regards to marketing and what's getting sold for video games. So anyway, going back to stat augments, I think I made my point relatively clear, which is that now that the boss keys are removed and stat augments are replaced instead, a veteran player is not only better at the game, but they have more choice as to what to acquire for stat augments. So usually whenever I play in these games, now that I have more options because boss keys go away, in fact, in the 5th biome, you have to collect 3 boss keys, which means that there are 3 separate, distinct opportunities for stat augments or artifacts to pick up. That means that I can bolster my character in any number of ways, and if I have enough obolites, which can happen, one could get all 3 of those stat augments or artifacts. And if luck would have it that they all happen to be weapon augments, then the run is basically over, and I have all the systems that I need. So I don't know what to make of this, just to say that it's interesting that a player can create a godlike run, or has a better chance of creating a godlike run when faced with a recurring or subsequent playthrough after having collected the boss keys. Also, as you'll notice, that is yet another way that the game is made easier. So as you can see, that Returnal has this idea of being a very difficult game, but I actually find it to be a lot easier than I had heard spoken of, largely because the game is, in my opinion, maybe a little too generous. To be sure, I think that the Tower of Sisyphus may have been a method to create an alternative game mode that was good for veteran players. The problem with that is that when I played the Tower of Sisyphus, I did 2 runs. The first run, I beat the boss of that place in the first and second iteration. There are levels, yes, but there are different phases. And in these phases, you repeat the levels of it, but with some kind of twist. You have some kind of breakdown on your character. Maybe the enemies do more damage or whatever. There's some modifier that happens with each phase. And the main phases are 3 in total, meaning that once you have fought the 3rd phase of the boss and of the levels, you have basically seen, like, with its textures and with its design, what the game has, or what the Tower of Sisyphus mode has to offer. And what you're experiencing afterwards is simply a repeat of that. So in the first playthrough I did of Tower of Sisyphus, I got to the second boss. In the second time I played it, I got a very high score. I was in the top 25% of the leaderboards, and I killed the 3rd phase boss. And largely that had to do not with my personal ability, but with luck. I got an excellent Rot Gland Lobber, the weapon I'm using now. So it's no surprise that I managed to take that and a lot of the artifacts and the boons that I was given all the way up to that high score that I got. And as a result, I didn't feel any compulsion to keep playing the Tower of Sisyphus. Unlike other games that feature high scores or score attacks, like Risk of Rain or Hyperdemon, either like Hyperdemon, the scale of the difficulty and the rapidity with which I could redo the game over and over again was not robust enough or not quick enough, or there was not enough really stats that helped me to understand where I was going. Now, at the end of Tower of Sisyphus, you do get quite a bit of stats on your performance, which I think is important, but it's nowhere near the articulateness or the specificity of Risk of Rain 2. And Risk of Rain 2 does a much better job of keeping your records of your previous runs. Now, in Hyperdemon is a first-person shooter with just an incredible progression of skill in the game. And I still have not beaten Hyperdemon, quote-unquote, but I have gotten a high score at one point to put me in the top 10%. And I just think it's so interesting that you can be in the top 10% of scores in that game and still not have completed the game, quote-unquote. Now, that's something that I think that the Tower of Sisyphus desperately needed, but didn't have. The Tower of Sisyphus was relatively simple, and I felt kind of underwhelmed after it. And with Hyperdemon, the way that you play that game changes between 10, 20, 30 hours even. The way that you play Returnal is a lot more narrow, and I am not sure if that has to do with just the way that Celine moves or the way that the weapons behave or some of the mechanics that the game attempts to teach you. But it feels very narrow compared to something like Hyperdemon, which is a lot more freeing and a lot more acrobatic, I would say. Risk of Rain 2 offers plenty of different characters so as to change up your playstyle, and each of those different classes or characters, even there, they offer different loadouts, so you can play in different ways. And the randomness of the items out in the world, in my opinion, is the perfect blend between the randomness of having good or bad luck, but also if you know the game of Risk of Rain 2, it can massively improve your ability to get good runs. So in that way, I think Risk of Rain 2 is the perfect blend of what the Tower of Sisyphus could have been, but wasn't, which means that in some ways we're sort of stuck with the story mode or the official main mode of Returnal, and I just think that the Tower of Sisyphus and Returnal, the game mode or the original story mode, could have been combined in such a way as to be kind of a uniform, much better experience for the player instead of compromising on two different game modes that, in my opinion, don't satisfy really anyone to the fullest. So I guess one of the last things to talk about before we fight the boss here is the presence of Blue Oyster Cult, Don't Fear the Reaper, in the game, which is surprising. I quite like the score of the game. I think the tones of it are balanced in such a way that it feels like it is perfectly in the soundscape of Returnal, where much of the percussion and the action of the game sort of adds to the score of the game, which is a little bit more synthy, it's a little bit more abstract. And so here you can kind of hear that they're trying to take Don't Fear the Reaper from Blue Oyster Cult and sort of morph it into that abstract synth feel. So in the cutscene of the game, you can see Celine on the piano playing the first notes of Blue Oyster Cult's Don't Fear the Reaper. Here you're seeing I'm having a problem with context sensitivity where I pressed E to use the grapple hook, but I was still within the sphere of the translocator, so I ended up being teleported. I think that's an interesting problem. Anyway, so the Blue Oyster Cult matters explicitly in the story of Returnal, where she's chasing after this Don't Fear the Reaper signal. Having Don't Fear the Reaper, which, if you know anything about the song, is about suicide. It mentions Romeo and Juliet in the lyrics specifically. Baby, take my hand, we'll be able to fly. So many of the lyrics point to suicide. And here we can see Hyperion playing the Don't Fear the Reaper. I think it's interesting to include that sort of song in this game, which begs the question of when Celine did drive off the road, is it with intention? Meaning, did she have suicidal ideation that reached a certain threshold where she decided to kill herself and the child in the car as they were drowning in the water below? That sort of means that it sort of begs the question of, is this a purgatory for Celine, or is this hell? Jacob Geller wrote and made a YouTube video that I think is pretty exemplary about Returnal, saying that the way that Returnal functions makes it seem as though it is hell, that Celine is being punished for what she's done, and that this is a sort of recurring loop that she's stuck in for all time, as a way to punish what she did. And typically when it comes to something like suicide, we tend to place a lot of emphasis on punishing those who commit suicide, just because it is such a taboo among us to kill ourselves, just because of what it does to the people who live and how we feel as though suicide is such a waste. I think that even if Celine did kill herself or didn't kill herself, I have a hard time believing that this is a hell. In my opinion, the difference between a purgatory and a hell is that a hell seems as though it was designed from the outside. We do often say that it's a personal hell, like a hell that we create. But to me, that is sort of a contradiction in terms. I always view a hell as a form of punishment, as a prison, which means that it's adjudicated from the outside. So that's just my perspective on why I don't feel like this is a hell. I feel instead that it's more of a, psychological deadlock, like I mentioned before. So I guess I can talk about Hyperion here in a little bit. As you can see, I do quite well against Hyperion. Here you can see quite a lot of projectiles being thrown, but as you can see, Hyperion is mostly stationary, and there are a lot of things that I can move around, but as you can see, me jumping and moving laterally, just as before, works just as well. There are times when I feel as though I have to dodge, or there are times when I have placed myself badly enough to where dodging helps me get out of it. Hyperion does move a little in between phases. Hyperion, I suppose, gets pissed off or upset, and so goes directly after the player. But I think that Hyperion is just not different enough compared to Nemesis or Ophion. Ophion, I don't know how to pronounce it, so as to justify its existence, really. And that's a big critique. I felt very dissatisfied with the bosses in the second half of the game, largely because of their stationary behavior. I loved the Frike, and I loved Ixion for the reason that they felt like they added onto each other as bosses in a way that felt very satisfying to me as the player, to have to work with it, with their systems, and overcome it. Here we're entering the Fractured Wastes, which is quite beautiful, I think, in its presentation, its aesthetic. Here you're seeing me transition from one playthrough to another, likely because I died. I'm trying to remember what the context was. This is sort of awkward in the sense that this is the first time I actually figured out that you can actually shoot the rocks here to create a space where you can use your melee attack. Something that I had never thought of before, which is why I always thought this tile set was strange, that it made you jump over it. I just didn't quite understand what the game wanted from me there, which is sort of embarrassing. So one interesting aspect of the narrative of the game is something Jacob Geller, I guess, discovered. So I don't want to steal his thunder, which is that in the first half of the game, you find yourself climbing ever upward. So this happens especially in the Crimson Wastes, where you're climbing the mountain. And in the Citadel, you're climbing further and further above to get to the White Shadow Signal, which takes you to this bridge, and then you're climbing up into the Citadel proper to fight Nemesis. In the second act, you find yourself doing the opposite. You find yourself descending. This makes sense, I think, for psychological purposes. A lot of the problems that Celine has have to do with going deeper inside herself, not necessarily higher up into the world with loftier claims or loftier ideals of what she's doing. I think she's slowly realizing or coming to terms with the predicament that she finds herself in. So here in the Fractured Wastes, you will descend into the Abyssal Scar. Now, to be sure, as far as the aesthetic design of Fractured Wastes and the Abyssal Scar, I think they're just beautiful. I think the snow and the way the projectiles interact with the snow, and here with the enemies on hand that I'm fighting, I think there are some repeats of enemies. As you know, these enemies were from the Citadel, so it's not as if there's a lot of novelty necessarily in the design of these enemies, but it does feel like in the design of the arenas and their layouts combined with the aesthetic of the Fractured Wastes, I do think there is quite a lot to say about the ways that the arenas have changed over time. As you can see here that I have the trait for the Hollow Seeker, that is the portal gun, and this shoots a beam hit scan weapon, which is really great against these flying enemies, as the delay in the Hollow Seeker projectiles itself make for a very difficult interaction, because I sort of have to lead the enemy, but that's a distinct problem leading an enemy when there's aim assist, which aims for center mass outside of my accord. I do have a low amount of aim assist, which can be edited in the options menu, which I think is a nice touch. There are certain occasions where I had sort of wished that I had just turned auto aim or aim assist, off entirely. These are really minor points, but one good example is on one occasion, I had a green support column or pillar that, as you know, will heal enemies further in the background. And the depth of the fight that I was in had another enemy that was directly in front, but slightly adjusted to the point where when I was trying to aim for the healing column, I instead shot at the enemy in front instead. And so I had to completely adjust my perspective so as to get a better vantage point. So as you can see, this is a really minor case. But in the case of fighting these enemies, it might be a little bit more profound, just in the sense that where the game thinks that you're aiming and where you're actually aiming may not be the same thing. As you can see here, I pick up another data cube. Apparently I had not come back here and shot the glowing orbs to present the platforms so as to get over there. I do like that the game provides some basis for coming back and repeat playthroughs after beating the game so as to unlock new things. One of the biggest aspects of these returning playthroughs is the sun surface fragments. These are items that you can pick up scattered throughout the world. They exist in a very particular place each time, or in the sense that they're in the same tile set, though this tile set can occur at a random spot in the world. Where they occur in that tile set is the same each time. So there's one sun surface fragment for each biome. With the culmination of collecting all of these, you end up going back and forth to the 20th century house to play out a set of cutscenes that you didn't get from beating the game for the first time. For those who haven't played Returnal, when you enter the 20th century house, I guess I haven't talked about this, you can enter it. The perspective changes from third person to first person and creates a sort of Resident Evil first person, or a PT, if you've ever heard of that game, experience with some psychological horror elements baked in. And over the course of the game, you slowly open up new rooms of the house that speak a little bit to Celine's background and a little bit towards the story at large. I'm not sure how I feel about these moments. I think they were very necessary for a narrative, but I think it's interesting how the conceits of the narrative construct of the roguelike system clashed so heavily with the gameplay that they had to create a moment where they effectively took away gameplay from you so that you could experience a large amount of detail. Now, with audio logs, that's not necessarily the case, because you're allowed to listen to audio logs as you play the game, which I think is very important. And I think ever since possibly Doom 3 and BioShock, the use of audio logs has been very important for getting a sense of story depth without having to resort to taking control away from the player in the form of cutscenes. But in the case of the 20th century house that Celine enters, you are getting story with gameplay, in the sense that you're controlling either Celine or Helios the child in these moments. But I think that the combination of the amount of backtracking that a player does with these story elements means that over time, the amount of combat that you actually find yourself playing is quite low. And I'm not going to suggest that this is inherently a bad thing. I think if you've ever seen the Tim Rogers action button review of The Last of Us, this is a very interesting point that he makes about The Last of Us, which is that you think you're playing a lot of gameplay, but it's actually paced so well that the amount of gameplay is something like 30%. Now, for the case of PlayStation exclusives with that typical PlayStation seal of approval, these, I love just when you're climbing up this mountain, you're able to get a sense of that snow. I love that difference, even just that minor difference when you're climbing up the elevation of this biome. I think it's beautiful. So anyway, going back to that seal of approval of a PlayStation title, I think there is a certain, like I said before, demand of what kind of a game that Sony would like to see on their platform. What I worry about is a similar problem that has occurred with the open world formula of the Sony game. And I think that's also happening in the trend of cinematic, character-driven, no loading screen, spectacle type video games. And I think that Housemarque has been known to be a developer that has sort of shied away from this type of experience. They clearly adore the old arcade games of the history of video games, and they'd like to stay in that direction. But when they shook hands with Sony, they basically agreed to make Returnal a game just as much about a character as it is about a game, which may be weird to say out loud, but hopefully I made my point. So I think in that regard, the 20th Century House stuff that you enter is a bit of an error. I would have greatly liked to have seen many of the conclusions that the player draws from those scenes played out in gameplay somehow, either with more audio logs or with using the environmental design of the tile sets to connote something else, or possibly through more xenoglyph archives. Here I'm fighting a mini boss in what is clearly a arena. I think here you can see that the coil spine shredder is probably not the item or the weapon, that I would have liked to have used in this fight, as I can't seem to get enough accurate shots, and I can't seem to do the active reloading well enough to provide a sort of damage output that I'm satisfied with. I suppose as we fight here, I can talk a little bit about some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that are latent in the gameplay that I haven't spoken about before. So one is the active reload system. So as you can see, every time I shoot, I have a small window so as to reload. In order to activate this, you have to click the fire button, or you have to press the fire button at the moment that you would like to reload. One of the problems that I mentioned earlier was that context sensitivity of using or pressing E to get from one place to another. But there's also a context sensitivity problem with this active reload, where the reloading button is not mapped to a separate key. And there are many moments when you are faced with firing a weapon, not necessarily the coil spine shredder, but with other rapid fire weapons where you are highly encouraged to fire as fast as you can pull the trigger or as fast as you can click the mouse. The problem with that is that you're not necessarily keeping exact count of how many shots you've fired. What that means is that as you're clicking, you may inadvertently cause the active reload process to fire early. And I just don't think that was an acceptable situation to place the player in a fast-paced game like Returnal. I think it could have been a different key and could have been Rebound, and I think a lot of highly skilled players would have preferred that. Another issue that players might have is trying to active reload on top of everything else. Returnal takes a bunch of smaller, simpler systems and places them on top of each other so as to weave a very complex layer of actions that the player is required to do. I think in the beginning this is overwhelming, but gets better over time. But there is, I think, some kind of upper threshold with players where certain skilled players in these types of games are just going to be better than others, to such an extent that a lot of early or intermediate players who find themselves hitting a glass ceiling, they may drop doing active reloads entirely so as to instead focus on other aspects of play. So anyway, that's the active reload system. I think for a player who does well with the active reload system, there are a lot of benefits, especially with higher skilled weapons like the Coil Spine Shredder or the Rot Gland Lobber, in the sense that it provides plenty of opportunities to fire faster and with greater power, as some items are beneficial towards active reloads. In this game, it's called overloading, and overloading or active reloads can give you certain benefits. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is the adrenaline system, which you can see here activating. The adrenaline system gives you certain benefits that aren't necessary per se, but they can help you over the course of a firefight. And there are adrenaline levels between 1 and 5, and the way you keep adrenaline levels is by not getting hit. There are several aspects of Returnal's game design that benefits not getting hit. As you can see here, I'm purposefully not fighting this enemy because it spawns these explosive enemies indefinitely. And I was curious how many Albolites a player could stand to gain by shooting these over and over again. As you can see, I think there is a sort of diminishing return for the amount of Albolites collected in these moments, or perhaps I'm just not good at collecting them. So as you can see, I'm going to eliminate this enemy relatively quickly just because I don't see the benefit of fighting over and over again. So that's the adrenaline system. So those two systems are something to mention. Another one is the alt fire system. So there are plenty of different alternative fires. One of them I've talked about already is the shield breaker. So alternative fires can be on any weapon and present certain abilities that the player can do with shooting a particular object or a particular, attack. And some are better than others. One of the best ones is one called the Doombringer. The Doombringer is a reference to the BFG in the game Doom, in the sense that it shoots a giant ball that will attack any enemy that's close to it, and then it has a massive explosion at the end once the ball connects with an enemy or the surface of the level. Clearly that is one of the best ones. It takes some time to charge, but if a player enters a certain arena and happens to charge it before a lot of the enemies spawn, if there's a lot of enemies, then it effectively is a get out of jail free card. There are other alternate fires. Some are better than others. I happen to like ones like Kill Sight and Shield Breaker, which are more sniper-based weapons with a high intensity of damage. As using a mouse and keyboard, I can fire exactly where I want to, for the most part, like I said, and I can connect and do a great deal of damage on an enemy's weak spot. As you can see, we're in the Abyssal Scar, and we didn't fight a boss fight at the end of Fractured Wastes. I spent a very small amount of time in the Fractured Wastes, as you could see, if only because I don't find the Fractured Wastes that great of an area in gameplay, despite the fact that I find it to be beautiful aesthetically. I think the Fractured Wastes is one of the most difficult sections, and I think that has to do with the way that Housemarque compensated with the enemies so as to prevent having to have a boss. To me, I think the lack of a boss in that fifth act, or in that fifth biome, is a big mistake. Here you're going to see me drop yet again and lose some health as well as my adrenaline. But anyway, yeah, I find the lack of a boss to be in Act 5, or in that fifth biome, to be a big mistake. I think if you're going to have a boss at the end of each biome, then you should be consistent. I know, or can imagine, that a lot of players found the existence or lack of existence of a boss in the 5th biome to be sort of a nice benefit, or a great relief, I should say, because a lot of the difficulty seems to compound upon itself in the second half of the game in a way that maybe a lot of players had a difficult time with. SkillUp mentioned that there was a big difficulty spike in the second half of the game. I think the difficulty was more, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a spike. To me, a spike in the difficulty is one where the things that the game is asking the player to do are above and beyond what has happened before. So a pretty good example is in Elden Ring, after especially the Altus Plateau, where it's pretty clear that the amount of enemies' health as well as their behaviors is something that was, I think, designed so as to make it difficult regardless of the pathways through the first 2/3 of the game that the player was likely to encounter, to make it difficult no matter what. In Returnal, I don't really see that so much. I think if there had been very difficult bosses in the second half, perhaps we could say that it's a difficulty spike. I think some of the mini bosses could sort of lay claim to the idea that they are a spike in difficulty, especially considering that these mini bosses that you're encountering here in the Abyssal Scar, if some attacks connect with the player, they give the player malfunctions, which can be very frustrating if there is an occasion where they get multiple of them. There are cases of critical malfunctions, which can be very dangerous to the player. I'll admit that I had never gotten a critical malfunction when playing through Returnal, the entirety of Returnal. But that's because I'm very risk averse to picking up items that cause malfunctions. More often than not, I stuck to artifacts and suit augments just because I wasn't willing to enter that space of parasites and malignancies and malfunctions, unless the game offered me an explicit reason to get malfunctions, like I've talked about before, with the synergies of gaining abilities or max integrity. So here, I suppose we can talk about I like the enemy design of the Abyssal Scar, and I love the aesthetic of the Abyssal Scar. One of the things you're noticing is that the behavior of my jumping and my dodging is quite protracted because I'm underwater, so it's nice to get a sense that the player has a lot more advantages in height and in distance and movement, which also allows the arena to continue to expand. So if you've been noticing, a lot of the ranges of the biomes have gotten larger and larger over time, to such an extent that here in the final biome, the Abyssal Scar, most of the time there are not even doors between arena layouts or tile sets, which means basically that you can see, were it not for the depth of the water underneath, you could see quite far. It's not to say that doors still exist here. You can see that there's an alternative door, but that doors are sometimes an exception rather than the norm. Here you can see just how far away a lot of these enemies are, and it just doubles down on what I've talked about earlier about the use of weapons in Returnal. Any returning player, pun intended, is likely to know that the ranges of the biomes is going to get wider and wider and longer. So they might be heavily encouraged, especially considering that obolites matter less and less as a player acquires the artifacts and augments and items that they need, to go after longer range weapons and to stay there. This is why I consider the Abyssal Scar to be contradictorily one of the easiest biomes, if not the easiest in the game, simply because at this point it's highly likely that a player is going to have a Hollow Seeker or a Rot Gland Lobber, and therefore can spend a lot of time shooting at a distance a lot of these enemies that are quite dangerous, but only to the extent that they can close distance with the attacks, which is rare. There are these spheres that shoot a massive amount of projectiles and waves, but only teleport from place to place. And it seems like the rules of the teleportation system are quite narrow, depending on just the tile set that they find themselves in. Here you can see that I'm so impatient with maneuvering through here that I get hit a couple times just because I'm sort of done with the idea of having to dodge these. And the game is generous enough to offer me enough health items that it will compensate for my laziness. When I had heard about Returnal, I had read a Game Informer interview talking about thalassophobia, which is the fear of deep underwater areas. And I had in my mind a place that had very few platforms, but had just such a wide expanse of underground depth, or underwater depth, excuse me, that I was sort of disappointed when I arrived at Abyssal Scar, if only because I had wished that they would have maybe created a scenario where very little tile sets existed at all, and Selene was just expected to kind of float in a similar way to when Selene fights Nemesis, and maybe grapple from one place to another. And that to me would have been very interesting, having to fight maybe like large whales or something. But anyway, that is to say that my imagination clearly overreached what I was about to receive. That's not to say that I don't like the Abyssal Scar. I think there is such a great amount of detail here, especially when enemies die. They explode in these sort of depth charge looking bubbles, and so I think it's just a nice touch, and it's a nice difference. I think what's interesting here is that I had been playing the game for around 40 hours before, well, maybe more like 35 hours before recording this, and there were still tile sets that I had not seen before, and this is one of them. So this is me seeing this tile set for the first time. As you can see clearly, I'm sort of confused as to the map, and it's saying that enemies are nearby, but I couldn't get a sense of where exactly they were. It was so dark underwater here that I had a hard time navigating until projectiles were being fired, so it was nice to sort of see. And once the obolites dropped, sort of where the bounds of this area was. So I quite liked this tile set, and I was quite shocked that I still existed in a space where I could return to Returnal even after 35 to 40 hours and still get some larger degree of novelty. As you can see here, the Holoseeker is just exceedingly powerful for the ranges at which we're dealing. Underneath the health bars of the enemies, you can see a status effect that's applied to them of being staggered. As you can see here with this sphere, it cannot be staggered, but other enemies certainly can be staggered. And that is very useful to the player, but the player may not realize that that stagger system exists in quite that way until far later in the game, just because so much detail is being thrown at them. Here, as you can see, collecting obolites is very difficult, but like I said, by this moment in the game, the use of obolites is wearing thin, just because there are very few occasions where a player may purchase certain items. I suppose we can sort of evaluate, now that we're getting close to the end, what Returnal is and what it desired to be and how it ended up as a result, or in its I guess, launch. Here you're going to see the second ending to the game. The second ending has much more to do with Selene's mother. I believe her name is called Thea. I could be wrong. We'll find out, I'm sure. While the first ending had more to do with Selene and Helios. I think that's very interesting. So in the 20th century house, you spend a lot of time uncovering rooms. The first set of rooms has to do with Helios, who lives upstairs. And so in one way, we can say, if you've ever seen Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock, that there is a very real, deliberate intention for the way that the house is constructed in Psycho. If you know anything a little about psychoanalysis, or if you know a little bit about Slavoj Žižek, who is a psychoanalytic philosopher who's done some film theory and film criticism, and how he has talked about the existence of the three levels of the house to represent the ego, the id, and the superego. So the ground level represents the ego, the upstairs where the mother resides and has a different voice. And then the id, where the mother actually lives, is decrepit and undead. Basically, you get to see her skeleton sitting in a chair. I think it's no coincidence that this game as well has Helios upstairs as the superego, likely being the way that Celine would like to view herself from her child's perspective, perhaps. And then we have slowly the character unlocking the basement. And going down into the basement reveals the wheelchair that Celine's mother likely sat in. And we can infer from this that Celine has quite a bit of... Here you see me again falling awkwardly. Celine has quite a bit of trauma, perhaps, with her mother, if this history existed in reality, or perhaps it has more to do with the id, with Celine seeing herself, but in a grotesque form, as her intrinsic desires, her drive of what she wants. There are some audio logs that point to the idea that Celine has a dependence on drugs, on, I guess, prescription drugs, in the sense that she is getting prescribed to them by a doctor. Once again, it all exists in a sort of metaphor. We have details, but we don't necessarily have as much core grounding to put these details into a sharp focus, which means that it's vague enough for players to infer their own story, but contradictorily, or I guess paradoxically, vague enough for a lot of players to become frustrated that there is not as much of a definitive resolution to a lot of these plot details. So for me, I was quite satisfied with all of this as a result, but a lot of players were, I could see or I could imagine, not being satisfied. So I think the narrative result of the game is quite mixed. I think in the future we can expect Housemarque to probably misstep in this once again. I really don't consider Housemarque to be a game studio with a care of narrative as the forefront. I think they did what they could with Returnal, but I'm not going to sit here and say it's one of the best video game narratives that I've come across. What I appreciate the most is the degree to which Returnal sticks to the development of the narrative via gameplay. Oftentimes, Celine is commenting on the world that she's interacting with, and so there is a story to be had there of Celine in denial and imagining this world with us as we're playing it. So there is a through line, like I said, of gameplay and narrative mixing together. Here we have a point of no return moment where once you drop down here, unless you die and return to the replicator, which is in the floor above, there's really no way to get back down here. As you can see here, I'm deliberating between what items to get. I, at this point, don't necessarily need some of these items. Shortening the alt fire by 2 seconds is a nice touch. But it's not something I necessarily need. So that's the, I guess, narrative conclusion I would draw, I suppose, about Returnal. I think the gameplay evaluation to make about Returnal is quite conflicted also, or as well. So, like I said before, I may be in danger of repeating myself ad nauseum, but I think that the arcade and roguelike mixtures that we see here did more harm than good. Where I enjoyed the gameplay best is in regards to just the way that the game feels and the way that the game controls, and to some extent how the behavior of the game is transparent to the point where you can learn the systems and you can circumvent them, or you can transcend them if you provide, or if you have enough practice. Almost die here, which is quite alarming. I think it's interesting that I'm having the most difficulty with the Abyssal Scar when I'm placed in a trapped area where I can't maintain distance, like I was mentioning earlier. So I'm having to actually contend with the enemies in the way that I think the developers wanted to in the Abyssal Scar, which is rare. So anyway, so I think one of the benefits is that transparency of systems, the way that arcade games manage to function, that make the game fun to play because you can learn and you can adapt. I think some of the problems with the roguelike system is that it attempts to be overlaid on top of the arcade system, and in doing so, it creates some dominant strategies that I think, due to a lack of scoring system or a lack of risk and reward for higher score, there's no real extrinsic reward except for getting better at the game that would push the player to play differently. And for the scope of my experience, I'm not a very extrinsic player, meaning that I can play a game without having to worry about rewards or progression, which is why I think that I'm shying away more and more from role-playing games that rely on numbers instead of experiences in order to convey what's in a video game. Now, that's not to say that RPGs are bad, it's just that that's something that I'm not necessarily interested in. So I'm less of an extrinsic player, I think, than others who want or need that dopamine hit. In other words, it'd be very difficult for me to play a live service game like Destiny, for example, just because I find the act of putting thousands of hours into a game to be not worth it unless the mechanics of the system allow for a rich depth of gameplay. Maybe like something like Hyperdemon. But even then, that game has a very narrow expectation for what kind of experience to have. So, long story short, I think that Returnal presents itself as a game that has a lot of depth. But I think in actuality, the game is quite simple to play. There are very few mechanics, and there are a couple of dominant strategies where once you learn them, like weapons and item synergies, that the game becomes very rote as a result, which is why I had a difficult time playing the Tower of Sisyphus, for example. I think that the tactics of the game are where Returnal shines best. In the moment-to-moment gameplay of the way it looks and the way it feels, it just gives you this energy, kind of like the new Doom games, or kind of like Hyperdemon, where you are energetically weaving from thing to thing, and there's a lot of detail going on screen, and it offers that rich, fast-paced environment in a similar way to heavy metal, for example, where there are just certain genres or certain mediums that hit hard. And I think Returnal does that quite well. But I think that the strategy of Returnal is where it suffers the most in the things that surround Returnal, and that has to do with design. I think that what you're seeing here is the tactics of an advanced player leveraging itself over the strategy of the game to the game's detriment. There are a lot of great things about the way that Returnal plays that's just not being developed here, and that's because I've learned enough about the game to where I can avoid these if I want to. And there's really no reason not to exploit the game in these sorts of ways. So that leads me to conclude that Housemarque had a lot of great ideas that they were trying to iterate on, but at some point they got too far into development to really make larger changes, and so they were sort of stuck. They were stuck in between these two genres, and they did the best that they could with what they had, with iterative testing and Q&A and quality assurance between them and people who were testing the game, between the engineers and the artists, whatever. But that they either ran out of time or there was just not enough in the pre-production phase of the game to really interrogate what happens when you mix these systems together. So I think if the game does suffer as a result, it has a lot to do with the pre-production phase. Now, I think to me that's exciting because whatever Housemarque comes up with next, hopefully they sort of understand, based on player feedback, what is going on in Returnal to create these discontinuities or to create these contradictions. And so I hope in the future, if they want to make another one of these, which, as they've talked about in interviews, they seem to be quite satisfied with the number of sales and with the critical reception and with the rewards, or the awards, that Returnal won. For those that don't know, Returnal won a couple of BAFTAs. In my eyes, Elizabeth Jane Perry's voice acting was probably the best award. I think she totally deserved it for the voice of Celine. She was really great in the Hitman series. I loved her voice, and if anything, I think my favorite parts of the game, of the Hitman games, were actually the briefings that she would do beforehand. There was just such a great deal of energy and momentum, and the specificity of the situations and the articulateness of the scenarios that you're being put in helped ground the humor and the fun of Hitman into something that felt like a Bond movie, something very sophisticated and almost sexy, which is a weird thing to say about Hitman because it's quite simulation based and not really a game that I would say is very lively. But there's something about that, living in that high class sophisticated society, and that Hitman's taking it down, that feels very rewarding. And Elizabeth Jane Perry managed to provide that with her voice. And I think that's also the case here, where with Celine you're getting a very confident and competent individual who is not necessarily the best of characters. And I like that they chose an older, middle-aged character who is not the best person in the world. And that shows a lot of depth in the video game medium compared to what we usually see, which is young, attractive, big-eyed, sort of anime female characters who are pretty paper thin as far as depth. So I enjoyed that distinction quite a bit, and I think Perry, as a voice actor, managed to do that. Here you're going to see me accidentally use the translocator. I thought that was going to take me to the floor above, but it takes me all the way back, so I have to fire again. Another word that they won at the BAFTAs, at least, was, I think, sound design or sound production, and obviously that shows, I think, more than visuals. I think Returnal is going to be known for its sound design. There are very few single-player games, I think, that accentuate sound and sound design quite this good. There are a lot of multiplayer games, particularly first-person shooters, that rely on the presence of great sound design so that players can pick up on where enemy players are in a player versus player multiplayer environment. But for the case of Returnal, I think it's a great showcase for sound in a single-player experience. And to me, that is the biggest element of the game that I love, more so than its visuals. So I think those are the aspects of Returnal that I think will stand out and that will carry over into the future. As far as like complexity and originality of what Returnal is, I'm impressed that it's a brand new intellectual property, and I would be very grateful if they did not make a Returnal 2, but instead took what they've learned from this system and they dedicate it to something else, which I think is likely where they'll go. They want to create another game with what they've learned from Returnal, but they don't necessarily want to create a sequel. I think that sequels have to sort of be earned, and I think for the scope of roguelikes and arcade games, if you're Supergiant Games and you're making a sequel to Hades, I think that's fair, if only because there's quite a lot of Greek mythology that they probably still have yet to expound upon, and the game reached such a high level of success compared to other games in the Supergiant repertoire that it is, of course, undeniable to get a sequel to Hades. Everyone's clamoring for it, so why not make that? I don't think that's the case for Returnal. I think the amount of copies that they sold for Returnal is a lot lower than people realize. So I think in that space, Returnal could be one of those games that is a one and done. Here you can see that I'm opening things to get some last minute artifacts and items. Gaining or fixing malfunctions increases integrity. Now keep in mind that that's not max integrity. So at this point, this far into the game, one of the problems of items and artifacts in a roguelike that has a definitive ending like this over and over again is that, similar to items in an adventure game or a role-playing game, the closer the items are to the end of the game, the less it can possibly matter. That is because most of the game has already been played. And so, as such, the developers of games where players pick up items, they would need to create items towards the end of a game that would not only make it very important for the conclusion, the last final bits of a game, but maybe if they have systems where a player can go back and reach other areas, it could assist or help players in that way. Now, for Metroidvanias, this is obvious. Navigation tools and being able to reach places that one cannot reach earlier on in the game is obvious. But for combat, I'm less sure how this turns out. I think for the scope of what I know in these types of games, I've always enjoyed the Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask games for their ability to create items towards the end that led to some very interesting combinations and results. So I think often of the masks in Majora's Mask as a way to, once you've gotten those masks, you can use them for other things. So that was quite an enjoyable experience. Unfortunately, Returnal doesn't provide that, if only because a lot of the items are randomized between layouts. So yes, there are traversal tools, but the effectiveness of items could be very great or very small, and it's totally random. And I think as a player gets towards the end of the game, this chance dwindles. So Abyssal Scar ends up, I assume, ends up being a place where players don't do a whole lot of backtracking or exploring for items. Yet another reason why you wouldn't want to do that at the end. Ophion is another static boss fight, and to me is one of the easier ones. There's a nice added twist where the floating orbs that we've been using to climb platforms is also the thing you have to shoot so as to reveal the weak spots of Ophion. As you can see, the damage that I'm doing is quite high, and I have a high damage weapon with the Void Beam that just does an insane amount of damage. And I think it ends up resulting in a boss fight that's not necessarily fun. I think aesthetically it's pretty cool that with each phase we get a different look to the enemy, but there's not a lot really to speak of narratively, at least until we get to the astronaut at the end. I think the astronaut as a leitmotif was used too often and with ambiguous connotations, to the point where a player may throw up their hands and realize that there's no way they can understand what they're trying to say about the astronaut, which I think may be true. I actually don't really see the benefits of having the astronaut being seen over and over in this way. Here you're seeing the astronaut the third time with its broken visor. There's just too many times where the astronaut shows up and we are not quite sure what to make of it. So this has been a commentary for Returnal. Here in a little bit we'll see the final cutscene and then we'll roll credits, but that's largely it. If you enjoyed this, I'm very grateful. After doing this ad hoc in this way, off the cuff without a script, I'm very uncomfortable with the result. I think I said a lot of ums and uhs, and I wasn't able really to carry across the points that I hoped to make quite as well. So maybe I'll end up going back to scripts for the most part. But I think after writing 19,000 words for Returnal, I realized that I had a lot less to say than I thought I did, and it could be handled in a sort of ad hoc way, in a way that maybe bored you to tears less, and so the density of the experience was a lot less. I wanted to get a full looking run of the experience of Returnal without having too many cuts or dissolves from one place to another, as I think that's one of the biggest benefits of Returnal. I should have done that as well with Dead Space, and I tried to do it, but the amount of time, even with a very quick run of Dead Space, is around 4 hours, and again, I couldn't think of exactly what to say for 4 hours, so I didn't want to waste the viewer's time. Here we see the car at the bottom of the lake, and normally you can go past this moment to get the first ending, but here, when we press E, we're going to get to the second ending. So, the first ending has a lot more to do with Celine's superego, with believing herself to be a more important character than she actually is. It has to do with realizing what she's done to Helios, her child. This one, I think, is the alternative ending that asks a deeper question about Celine's id, about her deep, intrinsic, or just, I guess, more latent particulars of her personality. See, as you can see here, the exact same use of the decrepit or monstrous thing in the wheelchair, similar to Psycho.
I told you to leave me alone.
I don't necessarily like this ending, if only because it takes Celine out, instead of to be the suspect of this case in this story, it turns her around and makes her the victim, the way that it's portrayed. Her name is Thea, by the way, but you can see that there's a pregnancy there. Thea perhaps underwent a sort of mental health crisis. Here you can see Celine taking the role of the astronaut leitmotif as being the very cause of her problems. So both as victim and as suspect in this final cutscene, it invites a lot of ambiguity into the story that I think is not a good thing. I think that in artistic pieces, you do want some defamiliarization, so you do want to surprise the viewer, but the amount of times that the game attempts to surprise the viewer with contradictions in Returnal is enough to go past a threshold of a breaking point, and I think that's a distinct problem with Returnal that I hope that they solve in the future. So I'm not saying that it needs to be closer to a harmony of the story to the gameplay, though I think that they need to do less shock value type systems. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed Returnal. I hope I haven't repeated myself too much. If you're still watching up to this point, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.